I first played Demon's Souls in 2010 as a rental from the local Family Video. Beat the first 2 bosses, and then gave up. Until a year later, just before Dark Souls came out. I grabbed it from a GameStop, killed a few more bosses, and then switched to Dark Souls. Until 2013, home from college on winter break, I started and finished my first complete playthrough. I remember distinctly thinking, well, at least I don't have to ever play that again. Then comes 2020, when Bluepoint's remaster was used as a major sales draw for the PlayStation 5. Like pretty much everyone else, I couldn't find a PS5 until around 2022, and, well, here we are. The Family Video I first rented it from is now an emergency health clinic. They say everything in life changes, except apparently I will always be playing a Souls game. This time I went all in and chased the Platinum Trophy, which is a lot easier than the original since they removed all of the weapon collection trophies. I've played through the original Dark Souls a few dozen times, and I consider it a real masterpiece of the form. I've played through all the sequels except Sekiro since I kind of bounce off samurai stuff. Having played all of them, I'll go ahead and say that Demon's Souls is my least favorite. The Bluepoint remake has new graphics, but is true to the original's gameplay, with the only real differences I noticed being more fluid dodging, a few new items, and the addition of the reversed world layout that I never tried. It's hard to overstate how different the gameplay of the original Demon's Souls was from everything else out at the time. Most of the popular action RPGs of the day had combat similar to Oblivion or Fable, a lot of that flailing, attack-mashing combat. I remember being completely dumbfounded that each weapon in Demon's Souls had a different moveset and reach, and that long weapons could ricochet off walls. It innovated on a lot of mechanics that are taken as obvious nowadays. But let's go to the basics. Demon's Souls is an action RPG with a strong emphasis on equipment, inventory management, preparation, and building a viable character through stat gains. The last part is the trickiest. This game does not have any method for reallocation of stats, or any way to recycle weapons, so a core component of the game is just knowing exactly how every mechanic in the game functions before you need to engage with them. A lot of mechanics are poorly explained. I remember in 2010 having no idea what the hell an S scaling meant until I looked it up. And the character and world tendency systems are still basically incomprehensible from in-game information. In a lot of ways, it's the same information imbalance that we see a lot in CRPGs, games that expect us to build optimally from the get, but don't provide us with nearly enough information to make an informed decision. You'll almost definitely need to reference a fan wiki at some point, especially if you're going for trophies. Demon's Souls isn't so much a difficult game as it is an annoyingly vague and tedious game. You can't tell what stats are optimal until you pass a point of no return, and there's no opportunity to experiment and find out without wasting a few hundred hours starting new games with new builds. When we find a cool new weapon, we're not able to tell how much damage it's capable of or how it would compare to our current weapon unless we just upgrade it. The weapon upgrading systems in FromSoft games have always been particularly onerous. They tend to reward sticking with the same weapon the entire game, since we're punished with reduced damage when we try to experiment on new weapons. It's especially bad in Demon's Souls, where high-level upgrade items tend to be locked to specific enemies that you'll need to grind repeatedly. A lot of the game has this sort of old-school tedium to it. It feels designed to sell strategy guides. The combat is still a lot of fun. It's mostly a game of positioning and timing, of learning how your enemies attack, and knowing your own capabilities. Since this was the first game in the series, the attack timings and fights are more straightforward. The player base wasn't expected to deal with feints or irregularly paced strikes like in Elden Ring. My preferred style is sword and shield, or using a large two-handed sword, but it's not exactly the optimal way to play. Dexterity scaling builds, using knives and curved swords, tend to have additional status effects they inflict in addition to better damage with bows. But we can also just gear for magic, which makes most of the game easy. Magic is overtuned, and there's equipment that can boost your total magic damage by around 200%. One of these items is the Monk's Head Wrap, In the original game, this was a risky item to use because it blocked a lot of your view. But the remake includes a hide helmet option. It's one of the few changes I have a problem with, and I wish they would have made the head wrap unhideable. It had a very intentional gameplay drawback to counter how powerful it was, and it just seems odd to remove it. But I suspect that whether they changed everything or nothing, players would be a little peeved about something, me included. Most enemies are completely incapable of dealing with the player walking slowly backwards while firing, so bows and magic already have a huge advantage. Magic also has an insane amount of utility over a more straightforward combat build. Using the various weapon enchantment spells, wizards can easily outdamage warrior archetypes in regular melee. When people say get good about Demon's Souls, what they mean is read a guide. Learn the overpowered builds from a secondary source, or just start using magic. Most of the bosses in Demon's Souls are gimmick fights centered around a single concept. The Dragon God is a hide-and-seek match, or the Old Monk just makes you engage in PvP. Other than the absolute nightmare that is the Man-Eater pair, none of the bosses are too difficult. But they're very memorable fights. I could pretty clearly recall most of the bosses and the tricks to defeat them even after 10 years, and I definitely couldn't say the same about all the bosses in Dark Souls 2 or 3, even though they were likely a good bit harder. It just goes to show, raw difficulty isn't the only thing that makes a good boss fight. Most of my problem with Demon's Souls comes from the level design. Unlike the later entries, Demon's Souls has a hub and hallway system. We start at a central hub, then travel through linear stacks of levels using the archstones. There's a lot to see, from the narrow tunnels, the narrow corridors, lest we forget the narrow cliffs and narrow walkways. It's mostly just corridors, where we primarily fight the legendarily bad FromSoft camera. A shocking amount of the game feels tight and uninteresting. The moments when it opens up are either beautiful or incredibly foreboding. But no matter how open an area appears, there's always only a single way forwards. Checkpoints are really the weak point in this game. There are only a handful of levels where shortcuts allow us quicker access to the boss fights, so the bulk of the runtime is literally runtime, spent retreading the entirety of levels. Beyond specific level design, the overall form the game world takes is disconnected but railroaded, less like an adventure, and more like a collection of themed attractions at an amusement park. The main star of the game is the Boletarian Palace, the first area we visit, and the largest overall. It's the area I had the most fun with, despite having most of the layout already in my muscle memory. There are a few moments in the palace where you can squint and see the germ of later ideas, of shortcuts, bridging areas, and a large, interconnected level, but not enough, and it seems like there's a reason the series didn't catch on until Dark Souls. Although the gameplay was largely unchanged, when it comes to the new graphics, Bluepoint put their ankles in it. They've adopted a sort of westernized, cartoony style that I do really like, mostly. I don't know why game developers have never made loose 3D fabric look good. The new backstab animations have a great weightiness to them, and I can't deny that the game is visually impressive. There's been a lot of hemming and hawing over the changes Bluepoint made to some of the original designs, and I tend to agree. An upscaling of the original boss graphics probably would have been preferable to the complete redesign some of them went with. None of the new designs struck me as terrible, just a little too Warhammer-y. The original designs painted a downbeat, threatening awe, like encountering a mountain lion that's obviously starving. It's beautiful, and you don't know if it's more or less dangerous than it was when it was healthy. But this remake cleaves a little closer to modern horror movie costume designs. It's not necessarily bad, just different. The remake has an updated soundtrack as well. It's a very polished orchestral score that falls within the narrow range of modern, acceptable fantasy orchestration. Triumphant soaring highs, but also some quiet, peaceful strummings. It references the original soundtrack, but is quite distinctly flattened. It's a pretty big change from the original soundtrack, which had parts that I would characterize as wacky and out there. But it's clearly well orchestrated and lends the game a certain spirit of grim adventure. The story of Demon's Souls is a bit of an Easter egg. The main chunks of story most players need are from the opening cutscene. Boletaria was a once proud kingdom. Its king craved greater glories and awoke the old one by utilizing the forbidden soul arts. And now the whole world is falling apart as the old one wanders around spreading a magic radiation everywhere. And demons run rampant, stealing the souls of humans. Our job is to kill the archdemons and delay the apocalypse. There are also lots of environmental details, character side quests, plus some additional storytelling is told by hunting through flavor text on items. But, to be honest, I've never considered these story aspects of Demon's Souls to be its strongest point, as there's only so much that can really be done when a game centers a mute main character with few interaction options and very limited side characters. There's a ton of lore scattered around the world, though, and I'll admit that I've spent some time reading through wikis trying to figure out how everything fits together. But I know that isn't for everyone. It's hard to say who I'd recommend Demon's Souls to. FromSoftware's games have a certain iterative quality to them. The games become better paced, the boss mechanics become refined and recognizable as callbacks to prior games, and so on. There's no way I'd recommend this game over Dark Souls or Elden Ring. Both of those games are straight improvements on the formula. Plus, Elden Ring is substantially more forgiving to new players. I suppose if you've already beaten Elden Ring and maybe some of the Dark Souls series, I would recommend trying Demon's Souls. But I don't think it's a very good entry point or end point to the series. More of a detour to take midway through. Even with a fresh coat of paint, the body is showing its age. On the pain scale, I'd give the Demon's Souls remake a moderately painful. The boss fights are a highlight, but the difficulty was never hard enough to make me feel triumphant, only relieved that I no longer had to slog through the repetitive corridor levels. Yet again, I finished Demon's Souls and felt enormously grateful that I was done with it. Well, that's my 14th review. Thanks for sticking around. See ya.